well with. So it's full of bootlickers. But basically what they do for you is they take the wire, they roll it onto a manual, and they split it right. And then they charge maybe 50% fee on that.
Let's see Daniel. You see Daniel? Oh, there he is.
You might
He's there. Okay.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I guess it's time. So this is the Home Networking Group. If you don't want to be here, then now's a good time to leave. I'm Stephen Farrell. This is Barbara Stark. Clicker. Yeah, you did the slides.
Anybody need an explanation of this slide? Okay. So we've already done some bashing. We're actually going to move Ted to number 4 and me to number 3. So Ted, because Ted put together some slides on where do we go from here, and so we figure that should come after my status report on security topics. So, and it's a really quick thing, but any other agenda bashing anybody wants to do? Alrighty, so we have Philip here is going to be taking notes, and Dave is going to be jabbering. And do we have the blue sheets going around? Oh, indeed. Okay. So we have 3 drafts currently adopted. These are the 3. They've all been updated within the past few months. And we will be hearing about them today. And you may have noticed, or at least I noticed, that Julius did a lot of activity on profile, and it's now profile 07. And so that's good. We're hopefully going to get that all taken care of. Oh, that's it. Okay, so I guess that means next up is Daniel.
Hi. That's going to be fine for Ted next. So, outsourcing a home network authoritative naming service. So, well, you should be aware of these drafts. Well, they have been put on hold since we believed at the time that we need to make some more progress on the HomeNet specific naming architecture. So there have been a few revisions where just well, the intention was just to say, hey, we're still here and we still believe we're useful. The draft seems to me in a relatively good shape, so it's more, we might have a few updates to really integrate the HomeNet naming architecture. So, but it's more neat than the structure itself. So how do we position? I mean, it's not that we're doing 2 times the same thing. The position is that the simple naming architecture makes service, hosts, reaching, discovering each other within the HomeNet and with no configuration. And reaching HomeNet services or hosts from outside the networks is out of scope with a simple naming architecture, for example. And DNSSEC is also out of scope, mostly because it requires some configurations. So the front end makes the hosts within the network reachable from the outside. And so outsourcing made sense only because, well, there is no need to outsource your authoritative service outside your HomeNet if you're not expecting to reach those hosts inside the HomeNet. It requires some configurations, and DNSSEC is in scope. So to put into picture, the thing we are interested is to generate the DNSSEC HomeNet zone, so internally, and then to generate also the DNSSEC HomeNet zone that's going to be published publicly, so outside in an outsourcing infrastructure. The idea is that from the outside, you're going to reach the zone hosted on the outsourcing infrastructure, and when you're in the HomeNet, you reach the internal view inside the HomeNet. But the mechanisms we're describing is mostly the one represented by the red arrow. So we are clearly outside the home network. So the HomeNet requirement recommended that the HomeNet zone remain reachable in kind of in case of connectivity disruptions. So that's the reason we have one HomeNet zone host inside the network. But from outside, we prefer to outsource the zone so that you do not expose your HomeNet to DDoS attacks, for example. So you have to generate the HomeNet and then to outsource it. So the mechanism you use to synchronize the HomeNet zone inside your network, or the one you generate with the outsourcing infrastructure, is we use a hidden primary mechanism. So basically, the outsourcing party is going to be secondary, and you maintain the synchronizations between those two. DNSSEC signing can be handled by your HomeNet authoritative service. Basically, your HomeNet can sign the zone, or you can delegate signing to the outsourcing infrastructure. So in the current draft, we detail what could be the motivations for one or the other, but we somehow recommend that it's being signed by the HomeNet. And you also need to handle the reverse zone, which is usually handled by the ISP. So configuration, you need some configuration for sure. So the idea is to make this configuration as easy as possible, and maybe that's not point. So what needs to be defined? So we need to define the synchronization server. So that's where you're gonna outsource your zone. How you're gonna authenticate with the outsourcing party, the authentication data. You also need to know from the outsourcing service infrastructure where your data is going to be reachable, because the public's authoritative server is going to be handled now by the outsourcing infrastructure, and also the register HomeNet domain. So basically, your domain name you want to host your HomeNet, that's something that you have to configure. So that's what you need for the synchronization. And you also need some parameters that you already need for the configuration, for the synchronization, to generate the HomeNet zone. So basically, if you're going to outsource your zone on one given IP address, you need to configure the NSR set with the correct address. And you also need to let the zone know what's going to be the domain name associated to your HomeNet. So there are no much parameters to enter. They could be pretty easily done. So that's where we think the document is. We think it's rather finalized. It needs maybe a review, some clarifications, but we think we're pretty much ready. Once probably the naming architecture is also in a good shape. So that's just, we think there is no much work. That's what I mean. Should not be too much discussions at that point. So I'm just summarizing very briefly, I don't know how much time I have, but there is another draft which is about how to, because, well, we said there are very little configuration parameters to provide, but we would like provide some way to eventually ease that configuration. So easing the configuration means what can be automatically being provisioned should be. And the other thing is that if a user is entering those parameters once, for example, if he changes box, its CPE or whatever device, there might be a way that the ISP, so that's the party we adopted with the HTTP options, provide the necessary information so that any new box, you just plug them and it's fine. At one point, you will have to provision this this information, but it can be, in the worst case, being only done once. So yeah, so it's not zero configuration in most of the cases, but it's a very little configuration. So the basic scenario we had considered that the ISP is providing most of the information. So why the ISP? Well, first, I was working for an ISP at that time. But then, because of the reverse zone, the ISP is at least providing you at least the IP address, and most likely is the party that has to handle the reverse zone. So even though you don't want to interact with your ISP for your domain name and so on, you at least interact at least for the reverse zone. So he's one of the actors you could be considered as a potential candidate. And he has well specific relations with the line, so he can authenticate that. And well, what can be used, DHCP is a good candidate as well. So that's for the basic scenario. In most of the case, the ISP identify your home net with a domain name, so you can use this domain name even if it's not a human friendly domain name. It can still be used. It gives you the IP address. It has some means to authenticate your line and yourself. So special relations make the ISP still a good candidate to help most of the users. It's not that because we consider the ISP as a primary basic use case that we're ignoring the other use cases. And in fact, we also described in the draft how a third-party register, and a registrar can be used that is not your ISP. The big trick is that we use a CNAME and DNAME, so you still be known to the world as a specific domain name, and then you redirect that to something that is being managed by your ISP. And we can also have the configuration to the third party being stored in the ISP, provisioned by the ISP, so that the ISP sends and provisions this, the CPE with the appropriate configuration. It can also be extended to an HTTPS JSON like these parameters in the future if needed. So this is the architecture we had. So DHCP, you send a message saying, this is my public key, and your request for a DNS zone template and some synchronization servers. So with that information, the DNS Template Server is basically the template for your HomeNet zone. So with you provision it with your HomeNet register domain name with anything you need, and then you just have to populate the names and host name and IP addresses of your network, those that you want to be publicly available, and etc. Reverse synchronization server is the same. So once you do the reverse, and that's where you have to upload your zone, and synchronization server is where you have to outsource your DNS zone. So, well, it's just a provisioning. We're just using that as to provision. So this is how to use a third party for if you want to use. I'm not saying any names, but non-ISP names. You can still do that quite easily, either provisioning, either redirecting under the name you want to be called to your ISP domain name, or you can also provision the ISP with the appropriate information your home router needs to use, etc., etc. So I think overall it's quite flexible. And that's all.
Hi, Daniel. Ted Lemon. We've met. I think that this is important work. I think that it's useful. There are some things about it that puzzle me, but kind of the main question that I want to ask you is, have you tried implementing this?
So me direct. Well, I have already configured. How to say, it's primary and secondary.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I've already synchronized those two. But no, I haven't implemented it.
Uh-huh.
But Jacques is doing it. And where is Jacques?
Hi, I'm Jacques Latour with Syrah. So I guess Syrah's been working for the last 2 years on building a secure home gateway project based on OpenWRT. And the purpose of this is to build a, well, you can look it up on GitHub. If you search secure home gateway, Syrah Labs, you'll find like a PowerPoint slide that explains what we're trying to do. But we're trying to set up a secure home gateway with all the latest and greatest stuff, including Dan's the naming configuration. The goal is to have DNSSEC inside the house, outside the house for the home gateway, to use a outsource AnyCAT DNS secondary service for the home for the external name resolution, and internally sign DNSSEC inside the house. So we're working on right now in implementing this in our prototype. So working on that, plus many other things on the project.
So, Jacques, I actually have a question for you. So how was the document? Did you find it easy to follow? Were you able to work with it?
It's a little bit long. So it should be, it should be, there's a lot of stuff that can be, I think there's too much details, but the essence of it is there, but there's a lot of details that there's all that many options that are documented, defined. So, we don't even know, for example, right now in the prototype stage, we don't even know if we do the signing on the gateway for DNSSEC, or if we do the signing, the DNSSEC signing on the outsourced DNS service, because we don't know if there's enough juice to do good DNSSEC on the gateway with OpenWRT and a limited CPU capacity. So that's what we need to play with and understand.
So it'd be great if you could send some of that feedback to the list. You know, what you found easy and hard with the drafts.
Yeah, I mean, what I was getting at with these questions, and I'm delighted that you're working on this, is that I think that one of the problems that I've had with the document is that it is quite a bit to digest, and I think it's probably not as to the point as it could be. And so it might be really helpful if you guys could work together to get the document to be more implementable, more to the point. So I just wanted to encourage that.
Yeah, and I'm also working with Michael Richardson. So he's more verbose than me on mailing lists. So this should help in our outbound communication process.
Yeah, I'm glad to review the draft. I mean, it's you can improve it.
You have a remote.
Oh, This is Dennis. I have a couple of questions for you. One is, I remember there was discussion about home.arpa, special zone for the home network. In your draft, your external zone, how much is it synchronized with the previously located DNS zone? And another question is, since home networks were intended to be used like with zero administration, right? Then if you have a million home networks and just leave them with no engineering attention, it's quite possible that the records in the zone and the devices and the HomeNet routers, at some point they will become desynchronized. In your document, do you provision any measures to detect such desynchronization and to make it all consistent again? Because if you take a network, then disconnect it from your internet service provider for a couple months, then connect it to a different provider, and there will be two conflicting versions of the zone because you changed the set of devices at the network. Then in your document, is there a way to make it synchronous and consistent again? Thank you.
So I'm not sure. I think there are two questions.
Yes.
The first one is how we consider the homenet.arpa?
Home.arpa, I think it was.
Home.arpa. So because we are mostly interested in outsourcing the zone, I don't think we would like to outsource home.arpa on the global internet. So in that case, it's a little bit, I think, out of scope of the document, because we're not really willing to have a home.arpa zone. I mean, it's published on the global internet.
Okay. So the contents of the external zone, or the contents that comes out of the home network, is it a subset of the contents of the home ARPA zone?
No. Usually, what is being published outside should not contain home.arpa.
Right. So the document doesn't describe a use case where I have already like 5 printers at home, and then I decide that this one specific printer should have a name and, I don't know, a reverse record on the internet.
Yeah, if you don't want it to be accessible from the internet, global internet, you should not outsource this zone. That's you have two different HomeNet zone, the one that is seen internally, and you can sign it with DNSSEC, and the one that you're going to outsource. But the one we are interested in the draft mostly is the one because we're describing the mechanism to outsource. So we are mostly interested in how you're going to outsource this zone. That you have two different zones is another issue. We discussed that, but we don't provide any how the zones are populated.
Okay, let's go to Dennis's next question. Dennis, if you want to explore this further, maybe we can discuss it further on list about home.arpa. I think Dennis's other question was around synchronization, or was that related?
Yes, if it goes off sync and the contents no longer matches what was in one copy, and then the other, they become different, then at some point in future they do connect again, and there is a conflict of the records because they're different. Did you provision such use case, and how to deal with it?
Okay, so if
you can just say no, and this will be okay.
No, I think so. The problem is saying you have an internal view. I mean, a zone that is being published on the HomeNet and a zone that is being published on the global internet. And I think the question is, how do we handle the situation where these two zones are desynchronized?
No, maybe. If we have another couple of minutes, I can explain. In the picture with the, or I can just ask on the mailing list. That's okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think that would be
great.
good.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. I'm going to let Julius in. Again, no.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Oh, you muted yourself.
And this time? You can hear me?
Yes. What did you do?
Is that right?
Yes, don't push anything. No. What happened? You have to keep it pushed or something. No, we can't hear a word you're saying.
Probably
Stop.
is going to say nasty thing about, so.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. No, it's like you say, "Can you hear me now?" and then you cut out. We hear nothing after that. It's the weirdest thing.
Right now?
Yeah.
Don't lean
Lean forward.
Okay. So something is muting me. I suspect Barbara. So, okay. I'm sorry I've missed your presentation, but 2 years ago when you presented this work, I had a question which I don't feel has been adequately addressed. Protocol, which is called DNS, which consists in simply, making an HTTPS request to a DNS server and exporting your address there. It's widely deployed and widely used. And I still don't understand, what problem are you solving here that is not solved by the trivial dynamic DNS protocol that is?
I think he's finished, and I think you got most of that.
So I'm trying to figure out where you. I think we provide two mechanisms to synchronize between the HomeNet and the outsourcing infrastructure, which is the DNS update and the regular way DNS synchronize primary and secondary. And I understand that you would like a third mechanism, which is based on HTTPS.
So I'm thinking about a simple end-to-end protocol in which the device that wants to export its name over the internet contacts the DNS server, gets a lease on the name, and recontacts it, say, every hour in order to renew its lease. Okay, this is widely deployed nowadays. It's a very, very simple protocol. Okay, it's end-to-end. It's not bound to a particular link. It's not bound to a particular routing domain. And so what I fail to understand, and I've checked your draft and I haven't found it, is what problem does this protocol solve by the trivial end-to-end protocol?
Well, I think we are reusing the mechanisms provided by DNS to synchronize two zones. Now, if you're, I don't know the mechanism exactly you're referring to, but I suppose it's, I have a zone and I push my zone to the DNS
You just push one name. You just push one a record.
So it sounds like, Daniel, you're not really familiar with the dynamic DNS mechanisms enough to answer Julius's question.
No, yeah.
Can I?
So maybe we need to.
Okay, I'll take it to the list.
Mark Andrews. what Julius is talking about is the way Microsoft does dynamic update. Their servers reap records have been dynamically updated after a period of time. So if you're using Windows AD, the host, the node or host periodically does a dynamic update and adds their own address records to the zone, and then that just lets and then the Windows server does something above and beyond the DNS protocol, which is then to reap them after a certain period of time, and you get that provides a garbage collection mechanism. There is ways we can do similar things, but the DNS update protocol is permanent. You add your record, you remove your record, but whatever changes at the protocol level that is specified in update is permanent. Okay? I understand what you're talking about AD, how AD works, Julius. So AD works that you keep refreshing your data and the server does a bit of reaping as a cleanup, as for the garbage collection, in case you've lost your power, you walked away, whatever.
That's right. So
Yeah.
the question is, why is the relative complexity of this protocol needed, and what does it solve in HomeNet that is not solved by the simpler mechanism? So I realized that this protocol scales much better. Now,
Okay, apparently Meet Echo thinks you've had your chance. Julius.
No, it's my laptop muting me. I don't know for what reason.
Echo suppression is working.
So the point is, what actual problem is solved by this more complex protocol that is not solved by the simpler one? And I don't understand that.
And it sounds like there needs to be people have time to think about it and access the internet and research more on dynamic DNS and things like that. And so we'll take that onto the list.
Okay.
Thank you. Anything else, Daniel?
No, I think I'm fine.
I have a question. How many people have read these drafts in the last year or so? So I don't see many hands like this, an author, the person implementing, and one other. So again, it'd be good to get some more people reading it if we think it's going to move along. So.
You want to bring up the security slides? Okay, so I'm going to present really quickly on what Babble is doing about Babble Security and what then we might want to think about in HomeNet. So what Babble is going to deliver, it appears, is going to be a DTLS-based and an HMAC-based solution. The reason they'll be working towards both is there are different use cases wanting to make use of Babble, and those different use cases have different requirements. The summary of trade-offs, of course, HMAC is much simpler. It is secure, but it's not encrypted, and it does have just few features as opposed to DTLS, which has a lot of features. And it's more complex. And so currently there are 2 HMAC drafts and 1 DTLS draft, and Babble is expected to pick one of the HMAC drafts for adoption. And these are the points that I have been asked to convey. Let's see. So given both a DTLS and an HMAC option, there is an expectation that Babble Working Group will probably recommend one of these. Independent of that, but informed by whatever they do, HomeNet needs to consider if it makes sense for one of those 2 options to be mandatory to implement within the context of a HomeNet use case. And in that event, HomeNet would also need to decide if any of the optional to implement features that may be defined in the Babble drafts, would need to be mandatory to implement. And then the biggie is HomeNet would need to define how keys and credentials get distributed in a HomeNet context. Any questions or comments?
Ted Lemon. So I don't think that the opinion I'm about to express will come as a huge surprise, but I think that we should use the DTLS document version, and that we should distribute keys, public keys, using HNCP, which seems like a fairly straightforward thing to do.
David Skenazi. I disagree with Ted, but so I felt I had to come and say it. HNCP needs to be secured as well, and the mechanism we have for that is HNCP over DTLS, which is going to need to be secured by something else already, probably DTLS certs. So might as well reuse those and do Babel over DTLS with the same certs.
I think we're actually agreeing, and you just don't realize it.
No, I just wanted to come up here and say I disagreed, but yeah, no, we're all right to the same thing. I'll be fine.
Okay, and we will continue this discussion on the list, hopefully.
So, Barbara, I wasn't at the Babel session. Was there any indication of timing as to when they might get stuff done?
I think they were updating the dates in their charter, and they were aiming for, was it October-ish? Or, I'm trying to remember. Okay. Yes, Philip. Why don't you, okay.
Could the two speakers just say that they're going to post to the list what they just said? Because I got no idea.
They want DTLS.
Okay. The note taker, Philip, asked for David and Ted to please post what they said to the list because Philip did not capture it. Thank you, Philip. Okay.
Okay. My name's Ted Lemon. I'm kind of a repeat offender here. We wanted to do some kind of detailed status update / question and answer session on the simple HomeNet naming architecture, and we have a fair amount of time, although not an extraordinary amount of time to do it in. So I'm going to try and go over what I think the open issues are in some detail. Wow, that's small. Sorry. I can barely read it. Okay, so what's been going on, it probably looks from the outside like zero progress has been made because the most recent update to the document really doesn't add much. What's actually been going on is that when I was working on the document, say a year ago, it became really clear to me that there was a lot of stuff missing that needed to be fleshed out before we actually went forward with the document. And so I actually devoted a bunch of time to that, and Stuart joined me in working on that, and very kindly provided some funding so that we could do the work. So that's where that's been going. I've been doing a whole bunch of foundational work instead of working on this document. But we've made a lot of progress on the foundational work, and it seems to have provided us with a great deal of clarity about how to move forward. So I think it's been a good investment in time. So one thing to talk about is that there's been some controversy over whether there should be two naming architectures or one. The reason for the two would be that the simple HomeNet naming architecture is a bit rudimentary, or has historically been a bit rudimentary. And so there was talk of, I was mostly the one talking about it, of having an advanced HomeNet naming architecture that would address some of the omissions. I don't think that's necessary anymore, and the reason I don't think it's necessary is because actually the document as it's written, if I were to fix all of the bugs in it, would probably wind up doing everything that really needs to be in the sort of must-haves that I see in the advanced HomeNet naming architecture. And that's not to say that, so the original HomeNet naming architecture that I did like 3 years ago maybe, had a lot of stuff in it that I'm not talking about here, but just the sort of basic naming things that we care about, or that at least that I care about, I think are covered by what we have so far. And let me explain a little bit about that. So the document's divided up into a bunch of sections, and two of those sections are the section on name and the section on authority. The section on name is about what name to give your HomeNet. We concluded that that would be home.arpa. And the section on authority is about how to publish records under that name. And there are a couple things to say about this. First of all is that in the name section, we actually say that having a global name for that is to say a name that's in the global DNS hierarchy, in other words, not home.arpa, is out of scope. But later in the document, there's a place where we say that we have to support somebody configuring the HomeNet with that global name, and I think that's true. So in resolving that conflict, I think that we would, I don't think that we need to get very detailed about that. And by the way, when I'm saying this, my goal here is not to dictate to you what I think is true. It's actually to see if it upsets anybody, and if it is upsetting to you, then you should come to the microphone and yell at me and not just sort of grumble. Anyway, so the point is that I think that being able to configure a global name on your HomeNet somehow makes sense and probably isn't all that hard. I'm not proposing that there be some standard mechanism for doing this, but it should be possible. That is to say, I'm not proposing that we define a protocol that would do it automatically. I'm just saying that it should be possible to do it. I noticed some puzzlement. So basically what I'm saying, and this ties a little bit into what Daniel was talking about, is that it should be possible for the stateful authoritative function in which you would store your names to be either local or off-net. If it's off-net, it could be a global name instead of home.arpa. It could also be a global name locally, but I don't think that the HomeNet naming architecture needs to specify that in detail. I think that if we just have the mechanism for having an authoritative name server, a stateful authoritative name server on the HomeNet, which is optional, not required, in a way that when such a service is available either on the HomeNet or off the HomeNet, that the HomeNet can know about that so that the right thing happens, then that gets us the thing that I really care about, which is the ability to have a stateful authoritative name server. And we don't need to require that all HomeNet routers do this. We just want it to be possible. So I think this is doable. I think it's actually not too hard to specify this, and I would like to specify this in the architecture document. Part of the reason that I'm saying this now is because one of the projects that Stuart and I have been working on is the service registration protocol for DNSSD. And what the service registration protocol for DNSSD does is it creates an easy way to do DNS updates to an authoritative server if you have one, so that services that normally nowadays are discovered using multicast DNS can register themselves in the authoritative service. And so if that's, and that protocol is designed to be pretty simple, pretty easy to use, and if we can have that as a value add feature on a HomeNet in the HomeNet naming architecture, not required, but we specify how to do it if you want to, and we specify how routers that don't do it can defer to routers that do if one is present or if multiple are present, then I think that we've solved that problem. Let's see. Yeah, so if you don't have a stateful authoritative name server, then it just falls back to discovery proxy. So discovery proxy meaning that you have MDNS on every link and you have discovery proxies on every link. And the discovery proxies are, when you look up a name, it just goes through the discovery proxies to resolve it, and there's no stateful name service of any kind on your HomeNet. So that's very lightweight, it's very easy to do, and at this point, we have pretty clear specifications for how to do it, which we can reference. So we're kind of, I think all of the stuff that I'm describing here is stuff that we know how to document and it's not hard to document. And that's the point that I want to get across here. The one remaining thing that has not been documented is how this stuff gets socialized through the HomeNet. So you've got a bunch of HomeNet routers. Maybe some of them are capable of doing stateful name service and some of them aren't. How do you figure out what you're doing, and how do you make sure that it works on all of the links? We need to specify that. That's one of our to-do items. So,
Robin Wilton. This is not so much a technical question or observation as one about privacy, and I'm completely aware that when you say, for example, you propose to resolve this by saying that the authoritative function can be managed either by the router or by an off-network service, that you're leaving the technical options open. My concern here is that I can see that that vendors will deploy this in a way that requires the off-network service to be used. In other words, that requires data to go from your home net to a third party in order to get the naming service. But in doing so, that introduces some privacy concerns for me.
Right.
I would like it, personally, my preference would be that if it's my home net, I would like the data to stay on my home net. Thank you very much.
Right. So yeah,
maybe it's just something to be aware of and perhaps to mention the privacy consideration.
Yeah, that's. I think it needs to be more than in the privacy considerations. I think that we need to document technically how that works, because if we don't, you're right, it's gonna leave open an opportunity for snoopers to snoop in. But yeah, basically we've talked about this at length before, and in fact there's some text in the old HomeNet naming architecture that talks about this, which we can probably use. So thank you. Okay, next slide. Multiple provisioning domains. This is a little bit scattershot. I apologize for that. I've had to prepare kind of a lot of presentations this IETF for some reason. So multiple provisioning domains. I don't know how broad the familiarity is with the concept of multiple provisioning domains in here. Basically, the idea is home nets can be multi-homed, and that means that you're getting configuration information from two different ISPs. Also, you have the configuration information for your home net itself. And those are really three separate administrative domains with potentially three separate answers to sometimes the same question. If you query the DNS, say you have a connection through Comcast and you have another connection through Time Warner, and you query the DNS for Netflix.com, you might get a different answer. And if you use the answer from Comcast over the link to Time Warner, you might get really not very happy results. So the idea with multiple provisioning domains is to essentially carry that information to the point of consumption, so that the consumer of the name lookup knows what the context of the name lookup was and can use it in that context and not in other contexts. I think that's about all I'm going to say about this. If that's not enough and you need to know more, there's a document, I can't remember the RFC number off the top of my head, that explains the problem in quite a bit of detail. Question? 7556, thank you.
Yeah, hi, Philip Brindeville. I'm a random OpenWRT basher, amongst other things.
Sweet.
So are you using the multi-homing to provide redundant service or load balancing or what?
We don't actually. I mean, so I have a list of open issues, and that's an open issue that ought to be on my list and isn't. Thank you for saying that. So the answer to that question is both, right? You may want multi-homing because you want to get more performance. You may want multi-homing, so in other words, you want to do MPTCP using both uplinks. Or you may be doing it because, for example, you have a home security system and you like the home security system to be difficult to bring offline by cutting a wire.
Or you might have a flaky rural ISP, and
yes,
sometimes you fall back on 4G or 5G service.
Right, yeah, right. So all of those are options, and they're a little bit complicated in the sense that depending on what sort of connection you have to your ISP, some things are probably desirable and other things aren't. So when I'm talking about multiple provisioning domains here, I'm not talking about solving all of the problems that exist with respect to multiple provisioning domains. I'm just talking about basic plumbing. Like if you do that, for whatever reason you did it, if you do that, we need to say how it works. And so that's what I'm talking about here. I think that, if you had a setup where you wanted to have, for example, fall back to 3G, 4G, whatever, but you didn't want all of your Netflix traffic going over that link, that's a problem that I'm not proposing to solve. I don't know how to solve that problem. I think that you could solve it by, actually, I think that the MPVD RA document does try to solve that. And so in a sense, I'm not saying that it's not solved. I'm just saying that I'm not trying to solve it. But that would be the place I would look. That's a topic that we've discussed quite a bit. We discussed it in the MIF working group back when there was a MIF working group, and it's still being discussed in the MPVD document. So the MPVD RA document. So yeah, it's an issue.
One other question. In your last slide, you were talking about multiple links.
Mm-hmm.
Are you talking about multiple physical subnets or numbered subnets, or are you talking about multi-homing in this case?
Right. So homenets are multi-subnet in principle. I mean, they don't have to be. You could have one subnet, but in principle, they're multi-subnet. They might have you might buy 2 or 3 home gateways. Your connection to the you might have one ISP, but your connection to the ISP might be through several home gateways on the way to the ISP. HomeNet is trying to solve the problem of making that network a good network. So if you plug a bunch of routers together, you don't get like 3 layers of NAT, or you don't get a network that where each little link is isolated from the other links, and you don't have to solve the problem of getting the network to work by bridging everything together, right? So the way that we normally solve the problem nowadays is we just have a bridge. So if you have a bunch of routers that are plugged together, essentially all of the routers are repeating everything to each other, and so you just have one giant subnet with many routers in it, and that kind of sucks. So the idea with HomeNet is to actually have a fully routed network with service discovery that works between links. So if you have a printer on link A and you're on link B, that works. So, sure. And by the way, I'm using OpenWRT for prototyping this, so we should talk. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, so the point is that I think we have in hand the technology that we need to use. The draft that Eric Vink and I think David, are you on that draft? Yeah, and I'm not sure who the other authors are, but anyway, that draft probably provides us with the lever that we need to make progress on this. And I think we just need to write this up. I think we know how to do it. We just need to document it. So that's another work item. So reverse mappings. There's actually 2 different problems here. First of all, do we care about reverse mappings at all? I'm not claiming to know the answer to that question. I care about reverse mappings just because I find them useful when I'm doing traceroute. Really, that's the only reason I care about them, but that's a good reason to care about them. Do we care about global reverse mappings? That's a whole separate question, because if we care about global reverse mappings, then we have to do delegation.
Phil Hambeck, I'd just like to point out, you just said you want reverse mappings because I'd like to capture, we've got to make the HomeNet debuggable.
Yeah.
And that needs to be captured as a high-level requirement, because I can't debug my network.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm not sure that the HomeNet architecture includes that. One of the probable future working items might be updating the HomeNet architecture.
Reverse mappings are also useful for name-based ACLs.
You should say your name when you come to the mic.
Sure. I'm still Philip Prindeville.
I know, but
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of ways that you can use reverse mappings if you want, but the bottom line is that there's kind of a big debate in the IETF about whether they're actually a good idea, and there are many people who come down on the side of they're a bad idea. Personally, I think they're a good idea. I'm not sure that we really need them to be that we really need a global delegation, but if we do, we need to figure out how to do that. And I know Mark said that he had a draft about how to do the delegations using prefix delegation. And I know that Daniel's draft also talks about a way to do that. So we have technology to do this if we want to do it. I don't know that we need to specify this in the HomeNet naming architecture, but I'm mentioning it here because we need to specify enough in the HomeNet naming architecture that if this functionality is deployed, we haven't said something that would prevent it from working. That's all. So we need to think about that. Let's see. Yeah, and also there's the point that Stuart and I think were discussing a couple of days ago that actually I'm not sure it was Stuart, but I think of Stuart because Stuart's Mr. MDNS. And so the issue is that you can actually, if you do a query with MDNS for 1.0.168.192.initer.arpa, it will try to answer that question, I think. Isn't that right? Like if you send an MDNS query, it will, and somebody out there has that address, it will reply with an answer. Yeah. So so that's one way to do reverse lookups. But if we want that to work with Discovery Proxy, we need to make sure that we actually say how it works, because I don't think that it's obvious. The reason I say that it's not obvious is because since the query is going to come in with DNS, DNS has a way of answering that question, and it's not necessarily the same way that that MDNS has of answering the question. So we just need to make sure that we plumb that correctly. I'm not saying that it's a huge problem. I'm not saying it's a big can of worms. We just need to specify it.
Philip Prindville again. If you're using static assignments, you want to be able to resolve that name even if the host that has, or resolve that address even if the host that has that address isn't turned on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think DNSSD would be a fail in that case.
Sorry, DNSSD?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or MDNS.
Yeah, it's actually really important to know the distinction between DNSSD and MDNS. Right now, it seems like they're the same thing, but part of the work that Stuart and I have been doing the last year has been making that not be true anymore.
Well, okay, so any scheme where the host that nominally owns that address has to respond on its own behalf.
Yeah, so for example, if we have a stateful authoritative server to which you send registrations, then that stateful authoritative server can remember this information. Also, Apple has something called a sleep proxy that will answer on behalf of something that registers with a sleep proxy. It's actually an MDNS service or a DNSSD service that's advertised using DNSSD. So if you're a device that's going to go to sleep, before you go to sleep, you can go out and say, "Hi, is there anybody out here who can remember me?" And then if there is, then you send that information to them and they remember it. And right now that's generally just stored in memory. It's just cached. So if the device that's remembering it goes away, well, then it's forgotten. But,
Hi, it's Stuart Cheshire from Apple. I'm not here with a question or a statement. It's a request to the note taker. I think this is a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. I think it'd be really good for the working group to solicit input on, do we care about reverse mappings? What are they used for? And to make that list, because debugging is one example.
Mm-hmm.
In the wide internet, sending email is another thing that sometimes breaks if you don't have reverse mapping. That probably doesn't apply here.
Yep.
I think capturing those arguments in the document would be good. And on the other side, there's the privacy concern that being able to send your machine a query and ask it to divulge what may be personal information is something we should also weigh up.
Yep.
And possibly the answer to that is that these reverse mappings can exist in some repository somewhere, but not publicly accessible. So there's so you as the administrator doing debugging have the authorization to look those things up, but a random IoT device on your network doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the answer to any of these things, but I think if we can gather use cases from people, that will help us make an informed decision.
So in other words, one of the things that you're saying is that we need to make sure that even devices on the local link that might leak information because they're not really owned by you in a sort of a technical sense.
I'll give a little example that happened this week when you and I were debugging code at the hackathon. I noticed that when I was advertising printing service from my Mac, something else on the network discovered it and created a dynamic translator to translate, to basically offer AirPrint service, which is a particular subset of IPP. There's a piece of software which is very useful. If you have an old USB printer that doesn't do AirPrint, you can run this software on your Mac, and it now re-exports that on the network as an AirPrint compatible service. I guessed whoever was running this on their laptop didn't mean to be. And with relatively little sleuthing, I identified the person who it was and found them in the corridor and said, you probably want to turn this off. And the fact that it was that easy to identify the human individual, I think would make some of us quite worried.
Yes. Thank you.
David Skenazy, Apple. Just on that topic, shameless plug again for the DNS Service Discovery Working Group tomorrow morning. One of our main work items is the privacy of DNSSD, as Stuart was saying. So if you're interested to work on that or see and come tell us if we're doing it wrong, please come tomorrow morning. Thanks.
Oh, look, there's a clock right there.
Yeah. You got like 30 minutes.
I've got what?
It's 30 left.
Okay. All right. So let's move on from reverse mapping. I think we got that one. Link naming. This is actually, we had kind of glossed over this before, and I realized that actually I was very pessimistic. In fact, I was completely dismissive of the possibility of being able to present a name to a user that they would recognize and understand. And I realized actually that's not really the case. We probably can construct link names that make sense, and we probably need to talk about that somewhere, not necessarily in the HomeNet naming architecture. The reason link names are important, by the way, is if you're using discovery proxies, discovery proxies have to answer MDNS queries using a subdomain that includes the name of the link, because that allows you to avoid having to deal with name collisions across links. So, so we have to have these link names. The end user might never see the link name. We'd like it if the end user never sees the link name, but if they do see the link name, it would be kind of awesome if it actually made sense. And as I was sitting there writing or reviewing the document, I realized, oh, actually, we could come up with names that make sense. For example, I happen to have Netgear RT7900, I think. That's what I run OpenWRT on. And it has ports, and each of the ports has a label. One of them is labeled WAN, and the others are labeled LAN 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if I were to come up with a network name, I would probably give it a name like RT7900 WAN, or RT7900 LAN, or RT7900 Wi-Fi, which then led me to think, oh, what about SSIDs? And so I went and I looked in the HNCP document and discovered that the HNCP document doesn't say how we select SSIDs. We really need to answer these questions, I think. So this is another thing that I think should be a work item. I'm not convinced that this goes in the HomeNet naming architecture, but it is relevant to the HomeNet naming architecture. So if it doesn't go in the HomeNet naming architecture, we need to at least figure out, we need to specify something that allows us to solve this problem in a nice way, I think.
Phil Prindeville. So are you considering VLANs and guest networks in this topology also?
Right. Obviously, that would have to work too.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you configure a VLAN, though, that's something that the user decided to do, right? So at least you could probably ask them to name it, and then it would have a name that would mean something to them.
Well, deciding to do it could just be checking a box on the setup that says, do you want to have a guest salon network, for instance, and he doesn't know that under the covers that's implemented using VLANs, for instance.
Sure. But then from the perspective of what we're talking about here, if you gave that a human readable name, the name would probably be something like RT7900 guest network. Right.
Right. Well, I'm just saying in your discovery and naming, accommodating VLANs would be extremely useful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Ted. Robin Wilton again. I'm not sure that selecting SSIDs is necessarily as straightforward as you might think. So, for example, a few years ago, after the Google snarfing publicity, one of the solutions that was proposed was that if you added _nomap to your SSID, that data might be collected, but it would be discarded or not used. That means I have slightly less freedom in selecting an SSID than I had before. And second, when I then added a wireless repeater to my home network, the wireless repeater expected to be able to add a suffix to the SSID. So _nomap was no longer the end of the SSID, and I had no idea whether it still worked as a way of suppressing use of that data. So there are a couple of reasons why that might not be quite as simple. I suppose another one from a privacy perspective is that I don't necessarily have to broadcast my SSID. There will still be one, but I don't necessarily have to make it public.
Yep.
And in privacy terms, I might want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if someone can't tell which Wi-Fi network they are seeing and trying to join, they might actually end up breaking the law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe not in my case because I set a password on it, but if it was an insecure Wi-Fi network with a non-broadcast SSID and someone connected to it, and strictly speaking, in some countries, that's illegal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a slightly weird area.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that we can perfectly solve this problem, but I think we need to at least specify some default behavior that users can use. And we already see default behavior, and the default behavior typically is the name of the network is Linksys, which is actually really bad because it means that whenever I wander by a Linksys box, that's the same SSID. If I ever enable Linksys as a default join network, I'm screwed. So anyway, yeah, I agree. That's a deep problem, but we don't have to. One of the things that I've been learning through this process is that best is the enemy of good enough, which I already knew, but it's amazing how many cases that applies, and I think this is one of them. Okay, so this is the other side of the stateful versus stateless authoritative naming thing, which is that if we have stateful authoritative naming, then the way we do service discovery is different than if we have stateless authoritative naming. Stateless authoritative naming would be discovery proxies, right? So, and we'd like it to be the case that services that support stateful to service discovery, which would be new services because this is a new protocol, people don't know about it yet. We'd like for them to be able to discover reliably that this functionality is available so that they can use it. So we need, and there's nothing hard about this. We just need to have it in the document. And I wanted to call it out because the document doesn't currently say how to do this. One thing that's a little bit controversial is that in the DNSSD service registration protocol document, and this hasn't been discussed by the DNSSD working group yet, so they may also poo-poo this idea. I just co-opted the domain search list from DHCP v4 and RA and said that's going to be one domain name, and that domain name is the domain name under which you will figure out whether or not you have service, because search lists are a terrible security idea and we don't need them. So we might as well use them for something else. Another way to solve that problem would be to create a new RA option and a new DHCP option. That might be a better way to do it. In fact, I am not even sure that I'm on the fence about that, but the problem with that is it creates more work. So we need to decide what we're doing about that. Yeah, so if we don't have stateful service discovery, then services that are trying to publish their information have to support MDNS. This is something we really already knew, so I'm not telling you anything new, but we just need to specify in more detail than is currently in the document how that all works. Name resolution. Okay, so name resolution, unless the HomeNet has a global name, which 99% of the time I think it's not going to, we can't use DNS delegation to solve the problem of how whatever cache it is that you're talking to decides where to get answers to questions about what's on your local network. And in fact, even if we could use it that way, we probably wouldn't get the right answers because of the privacy issues that we were just talking about. So the HomeNet routers need to be able to do bypass for local zones. And there's nothing really hard about this. We just need to specify it. It's not specified in the document right now. So that's another work item. DNSSEC. Right now, the document doesn't say how to do DNSSEC for home.arpa because DNSSEC depends on delegation of trust, and a locally served zone can't have a delegation of trust from the root zone. So how do you do that? Well, the only way that I can think of to do that is some kind of tofu thing or some kind of enrollment process, or tofu by default enrollment is better if you can do it. So we've had some discussions about this. I can't remember. I think it was Toko who was talking about this and wanted to work on it. This is a cool problem. I'm not sure that it belongs in the simple HomeNet naming architecture document. Right now, the simple HomeNet naming architecture document actually says two different things that are contradictory about how we support DNSSEC, and we should resolve that one way or the other.
Phil Hambaker, I can't remember any of them off my head, but in the days when we were trying to deploy DNSSEC and ICANN was not wanting to deploy DNSSEC, we did develop.
Yeah, TLV, or DNS look-aside or something like that.
Well, actually, there was a whole family of them.
Yeah.
TLV was the one that was deployed, but there were other ways that the other way that was proposed was to stick a cert in the top-level domain, and there are others that have been developed since. So this is a soluble problem.
Yeah, definitely. You have to configure the trust anchor somehow. So what I kind of think would work well enough to be sensible would be that when you first connect to a HomeNet, this absolutely requires, there's no way to do this without some kind of special behavior for HomeNets. The behavior could be that you configure a trust anchor manually in your resolver configuration on your host. It could be that there's some way that the host can discover the trust anchor for the local HomeNet, and having discovered it, then whenever it goes to that HomeNet, it can know that it's on that HomeNet and not some other HomeNet, and therefore disambiguate. And I think that the way to do that is actually just to generate a DS record and use that as an ID, or generate a zone signing key, put it in a DS record, and use that as the ID for the network. So we could do this in the HomeNet naming architecture. I don't think that it would be a big holdup. I'm sure it would be more work than not doing it. So we should decide whether we want to do it. Stephen made a proposal. I don't know if you proposed this publicly or privately to me. Okay. Yeah. So the proposal was that we just get through this. Just have a bunch of biweekly working group. What do they call them? Interim meetings. Yeah. A bunch of interim meetings. This is something that various working groups do, and it can be quite effective for getting work done. I could just be in background mode and grind on this for a while, but I think that we would actually make progress faster if other people are interested in working on this with me. I say me because I've been doing most of the work on this. There are other interested parties, like Stuart is interested and is on the document and has made a lot of useful corrections and comments. But if there's interest in the working group and actually getting this thing done and out, I think that one way to make that happen would be to just do 5 or 6 biweekly meetings and just get through it. So.
Like Andrews again, Ted, I'd use CDS rather than DS.
Okay. I mean, I think we can just put it to the mailing list, right? I don't.
Yeah, well, let's just real quick ask for if we suggested biweekly meetings by show of hands of the people in the room who would be interested. Okay, so I'm seeing about half a dozen. Okay, Julius, I'm going to let you in. You behave this time.
Okay, so I'd just like to quickly mention something that I mentioned in London and that I've mentioned on the mailing list. So Barbara will probably mute me because she's fed up with me.
In fact, you have just been muted. I don't think by Barbara. Julius, I think it might be your echo cancellation. You need to put on a headset or something. Oh, we lost him.
Okay, he's going to try again.
There he is.
Huh.
Whatever that is getting worse.
Julius, we're not seeing you anymore, so things have gone from bad to worse.
He's in jabbering.
Possibly, yeah. Okay, good. He's jabbering.
He's about to. So I think one of the things I thought about that process, whether it's bi-weekly or some other date, was
Sure.
to not necessarily to do that, and at the end of it, that we just publish this document, but maybe we might, at the end of that, we want a document that's kind of editorially finished.
Yeah.
And then hopefully we can get feedback from implementers on.
Yep.
And so we're not really proposing this to get us to a publication request for the document, but more just to get the document in a state where it's people can start implementing and giving feedback.
Yeah, sounds good.
Jabber relay from Julius Grabchek. We need a prototype to play with all of these ideas.
Yes.
What's the implementation status? Can we have an implementation to play with?
Okay, so this is a fine question. Any other questions? Just kidding. So we've actually been working quite a bit on implementation. We have, so actually there's something that I didn't actually hit on in the slides. It's mentioned in the slides, but I think I didn't actually mention it when I spoke about it, which is, is it here? Yeah, so there's this one thing, when I first started working on the simple HomeNet naming architecture, I came up with this really cool idea called Discovery Relay. I think that it is actually a really cool idea. I'm not sure that it's actually, that HomeNet is the place where it's most applicable. I think that it's actually more applicable in corporate networks. I've done a whole bunch of work on implementing Discovery Relay. And we have a DNSSD SRP implementation that Tim. Hi, Tim. I can't read that from here. So during the hackathon, Tim put together a client side, and we're gonna work on a server side. We're gonna work on a hack to bind 9 so that we'll have a server side version of that. I've also been working on Discovery Proxy, but I don't actually have a fully working Discovery Proxy yet. So the implementation status of this is that we're not quite there yet, and I agree that that is a very important thing. The reason why we don't have a Discovery Proxy yet is because I prioritize doing the Discovery Relay work, which is essentially done at this point. The other issue, of course, is that the code that I'm working on, I'm not sure quite how to get out. It's definitely going to be open source at some point, but that's still a work in progress. I might even have had a slide about this somewhere. Oh, you know what? No, it's in a different presentation. So the answer is that we really do need to prototype this, and I would be happy to work with you on that, Julius, if you are interested. And if you don't particularly want to work on it and just want to see it happen, I think that it's my belief, based on where the work is going, that this is going to happen soon, but it is not done yet. So that's where it's at.
Okay, so back to the bi-weekly, we will take that to the list and create a doodle poll to find, well, and actually it would probably be good if you're interested, if you could email the chairs that you're interested in what your time zone is, so we can at least have some idea of what sorts of times to pick.
4 in the afternoon, European time. It always ends up in the same place.
Well, it depends on whether we have people in the U.S. West Coast. Where are you, Ted? Oh,
I'm on the East Coast. Stuart's
Okay.
on the West Coast. Stuart and I have a standing meeting on Thursdays, and we often pull in other things to that meeting. So we could potentially, if it's bi-weekly, we could just have that be one of our meetings.
and I don't think I've seen anyone from Asia, but we should certainly allow that to happen on the list.
Okay.
That's the end of this deck.
I believe that's the end of this deck.
So,
We've got about 8 minutes left.
Okay, well, this is not long. I mean, this could turn into a very long conversation, but I don't think it needs to. I just want to sort of point out that we ain't done yet.
No, I'm
So Basically, when I was sitting down working on the HomeNet naming architecture presentation, it occurred to me that there's actually a fair amount of stuff that we haven't done yet that is still on my mental to-do list, which doesn't mean that we have to do it, of course, but it is on my mental to-do list. And so I figured that I would share my mental to-do list with you all so that, you know, you can laugh and throw tomatoes. I don't think that we actually have a complete HomeNet specification yet. And I think that even when we're done with the simple HomeNet naming architecture, we will still have more work to do. I don't think that if you were to just ask some random router vendor to go implement HomeNet right now that they would succeed. One of the things that I think is missing is something that's like the HomeNet naming, or sorry, like the HomeNet architecture, but with explicit details about how to put the whole thing together. I don't think we have that. I don't think that the HomeNet architecture is that. So that's something that needs to happen. And then, you know, sort of a subsidiary bit of that is that we need some stuff about how HNCP does the various things that need to be done, not just the things that the HNCP spec does, but the other things that we've come up with since then. And also how we operate HomeNet naming. So I don't know if we need, I think that the SNC, the simple HomeNet naming architecture could be the HomeNet naming architecture ops document. I think that if we succeed in doing the things that I laid out in the previous presentation, that we'll actually have that. But we need to have explicit instructions on how to set all this stuff up, or else, and it needs to be something that somebody who's not an IETF person would be able to use to produce a HomeNet router that would successfully connect to someone else's HomeNet router and work, right? I think that there are some more technical things which I'll discuss in later slides. And also, I think that we need to come through the HomeNet architecture and make sure that we haven't missed anything, because I actually haven't done that recently. I don't think I've looked at the HomeNet architecture itself in at least a year. So it's quite possible that there are things that we have forgotten about in there that we need to either talk about or decide we're not doing. So technical topics we could discuss in no particular order and in no particular degree of importance. The DNSSEC on the HomeNet thing that I was just talking about, that's that line item. HomeNet identifier, which is probably just DNSSEC on the HomeNet. Key sharing, that's how to set up public keys using HNCP. I don't think that we actually have a spec for how to do that yet. We need to do that. I don't think it's hard, but we need to do it. One of the things that HomeNets do when your IPv4 uplink goes away is that IPv4 stops working on the network, which can interrupt communications on the network. I think we need to talk about that. Babel keying, Barbara actually already talked about. Link naming, I talked about. SSID naming, I talked about. So configuration, it would be nice if there was a way to write an app for your HomeNet that would configure your HomeNet that isn't proprietary, because I don't know how many people here have worked with the various IoT devices that you can buy for your home now, but it seems like each one of them has an app. And this is not good. You don't want every single device to have its own app. And the only way that it can be true that every single device doesn't have to have its own app is if we have a standard way of configuring HomeNets. So it might be worth writing a document that explains how to do that. It might also be boiling the ocean, I don't know. But I think it's worth talking about at some point. Enrollment, how do we establish trust? This, I think maybe it was David was alluding to this problem. We don't actually have an answer for that. We need to have an answer for that. Delegation of zones. We don't actually have a spec that we've selected, although we've certainly talked about it. And what Daniel presented is something, and I know that Mark also worked on something. So we have potentially answers for those, but we need to actually make those happen. I think it's actually kind of important that we consider what the HomeNet working group should say about port control protocol, because the IETF put a lot of work into port control protocol. It's actually a really great protocol for doing things you might want to do on your HomeNet, and it would be nice if you could do them. So we need to have the discussion about multiple provisioning domains. I don't know that that's necessarily a simple HomeNet naming architecture thing, which is why I mention it here. And I think that it might be interesting to talk about how you use devices on your HomeNet, how you connect to devices on your HomeNet when you aren't home. And that should work without you having to let everybody else get onto your HomeNet. So I don't think we have a document that explains that right now, and I think it'd be worth writing one. So these are the things that are on my list. I'm sure that there are things that are on your list that aren't on this list. And I suspect there are also things that are on my list that aren't on this list, but this is what I came up with. So.
Philip, on the last slide, did you have a root cause for why the external IPv4 failure trickles inwards?
It's in the HNCP spec that if your IPv4 uplink goes away, you deconfigure IP on all internal interfaces. And so I think the reasoning for that is that you wanted to avoid having devices try to use IPv4 when it's not working. And in principle, if you have IPv6 working on your HomeNet and you're not using IPv4 for connecting for intra-HomeNet connections, that should be okay. But if that's the way we want to solve that problem, then we need to be a lot more explicit about that than we are right now. Because right now, my experience when I first started using HNCP was that I was happily using my network and I did something, and about 10 minutes later, my whole network just stopped working because I didn't actually have IPv4 working or IPv6 working on the whole routed network at that time. And so when my IPv4 uplink went away, I just couldn't use my network anymore. This is not desirable. So.
Okay, I don't object to having IPv6 configured also, except that there are a lot of dumb machines which will then try to get off network via IPv6 if they can, and if your ISP isn't supporting that also, then you're going to get a lot of annoying timeouts at the very least, and unreachables potentially.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that's really a problem at this point? I mean, you have happy eyeballs running on most things at this point, and so in principle, if you have working IPv4 and non-working IPv6, you should just wind up with an IPv4 connection and vice versa. So, I mean, what you just said actually applies equally and is the motivation behind the specification in HNCP that if IPv4 isn't available, you drop IPv4 because you don't want people picking IPv4 and not being able to get off the network.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were saying that IPv6 was mandatory in all cases.
Well, so the reasoning was that in fact IPv6 would always be working because this is the future, and IPv4 might not be working.
Okay, wake me up when we get to the future.
Okay, no, you're actually in the future. I don't know if you've noticed. It's just that it's not quite the future we expected. And it's also kind of unevenly distributed.
Yeah, my ISP didn't get that memo. So.
Yeah, sorry. Yep. So, any other?
Is that it?
That's all I got.
You want to wrap up? Okay, so I think we, the chairs, have an action item to set up some doodle polls and things like that for people who want to do the bi-weekly meetings with Ted to try and get this to a real implementable state. Did we have other action items? Okay, and I'm going to be pushing Julius really to get the Babble profile completely done in the editor's queue. We might do a collection kitty to get Julius a new headphone. Yeah, and I think that's it. Thank you, everybody. It was fun.
They're not real language.
Well,
this is anything.
Yeah.
Trying to summarize at the same time. No. There was just this bit here.